Welcome everyone to this important webinar. I am Shauna Cooper, the Director of Programs at Ribbon, a national nonprofit organization located in the District of Columbia metropolitan area. Today I want to share with you what Ribbon is and, more importantly, our mission. Ribbon serves as the National Technical Assistance Provider for Gilead Sciences, Inc. HIV/AIDS Positively Initiative. Our initiative, in which we provide the technical assistance, is called Rock for Aging. I want to emphasize that while Gilead is the funder of this initiative, they have not contributed to the development of this webinar. October is National Domestic Violence Month, and I'd like to acknowledge the experiences of both women and men and the significance of raising awareness about domestic violence, including various forms, signs, and how to provide support to those affected. Our webinar titled HIV and IPV, Insights and Solutions, IPV being intimate partner violence, features two distinguished male panelists, Steve Ibarra and Dr. David Fawcett. Steve Ibarra is a remarkable individual, a San Francisco native, and a dedicated community advocate. He is a founding member of two HIV long-term survivor programs in San Francisco, Honoring Our Experiences, Shanti, and the SFAF 50+ program. Steve's involvement also extends to volunteering at San Francisco's General Hospital and the Gabayo Project.
I just had a
serving.
Oh dear.
Could you please mute your mic? And serving as the houseless community, the project serving the houseless community. Notably, in 1991, he played a pivotal role in bringing clinical trials to Africa and Central America through the adult AIDS clinical trials. Today, he shares his inspiring story of intimate partner violence. Our second panelist is Dr. David Fawcett, a renowned substance abuse expert, certified sex therapist, and clinical psychotherapist. He has dedicated over 30 years to mental health and substance abuse issues, specifically within the LGBTQ+ community. His areas of expertise include addiction, trauma, and issues related to chronic illness, especially HIV/AIDS. Dr. Fawcett is a national trainer for the HIV Spectrum Project and actively presents workshops on these topics. So I would like for us to give a nice virtual welcome to both Steve and Dr. Fawcett. So we're going to go ahead and get started in just a second, but I would like to share some rules of engagement before we begin. First, if everyone could please mute their mics, that would be great, so we don't pick up any background noise or sounds. And here are some rules of engagement that I would like to share so that we can make sure that we have a meaningful discussion and we'll have enough time for our presenters to share their thoughts and insights, but also have some time carved out at the end so that you can ask any questions. So with that said, we encourage everyone to be respectful of people's experiences and thoughts. Please, again, hold your questions until the end of the discussion. Also, we ask that you continue to keep your mics muted until the end. A Q&A session will be facilitated then, and we do encourage the use of the chat to facilitate complementary discussion. So although we ask you to hold your questions to the end, we do invite you to have some discussion in the chat below. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, please. Fawcett, is there anything in your bio that I did not mention that you would like to share with the people present in the room?
Only that a lot of this today is not in my professional work, but I'm a gay man with HIV, diagnosed in ADH, so long-term HIV with a lot of the issues, addiction issues myself in recovery. So much of this is personal for me as well. So I bring that to this discussion as well.
Thank you. And Steve, I'm going to ask the same question of you. Is there anything that I did not mention in your introduction that you'd like to share with people in attendance? Okay, I'm going to take that as a no.
Okay.
You said something, Steve?
I did want to mention that I also have my mother was, I didn't mention her, and my mother was, was, taken away to an institution when I was 6 years old. So she was institutionalized for schizophrenia my whole childhood. And my whole childhood was kind of blanked out of my memory of that whole time of 6 years and from my birth mom. That's
Okay.
all.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that background information, Steve. We appreciate
Yeah.
it. And since we have you on the floor, we're going to begin the questions with you, okay? So
Okay.
our first question is, what are some of the unique challenges and obstacles that men living with HIV face when dealing with intimate partner violence? And how can we as a society better address these issues?
That's very interesting because we talked about this a little earlier, and I don't remember anything strong that would affect HIV through domestic violence, because I think in most of my main two problematic relationships, they were both well aware of HIV before we got together. And so there was no secrets there in that at all. And nothing was really a problem. I never was offended by anything about HIV. And that's pretty much what I do in my life. So that's pretty much a big part of me. And it was not an issue.
Okay. Thank you. You mentioned when you added on to the information that I did not share in your introduction that your mother she experienced some mental health challenges during your formative years, and that you don't recall some of those experiences during that time. Um, Coupling with that, can you share your personal journey of surviving intimate partner violence and living with HIV? So that's the first part of the question. And then the second question, well, I'll let you answer that first. What can you share about your personal journey of surviving intimate partner violence and living with HIV?
That's interesting because we really didn't see the merging of HIV with my domestic violence issues that I had with the last two partners that I was with. And so they really didn't come together, since I was pretty clear about my HIV status from the beginning of both relationships.
Okay.
But
And then,
in my childhood, there was
Mhm.
really no connection with HIV and domestic violence. Yeah, but so I lived in a violent community and family my whole life since I was really, really young. And we lived in a Sunnydale projects where there was a lot of friction. And my mom was schizophrenic, so she would fight anyone who came to the door.
Mhm.
My dad was a violent alcoholic, and he was very violent. And I constantly kept an eye on his coming and going at night to make sure that once he dragged my mother or my stepmother into the kitchen to cook for him, once the violence started, I was ready to run out and stop him and call the police. And it was an automatic response for me every single time.
So let me ask you this. Do you think your experiences, as your childhood experiences, facilitated some of these traumatic adult experiences that you have encountered? And if so, how?
That's a really good question, because I have been told by professionals that my childhood definitely, I definitely am, um, I'm, I attract these types of individuals that are violent people. And it shocks me because I don't know how that happens, but it happens automatically. And I'm born and raised that way, with um, attracting these type of individuals with violence, and I grew up with that. So
Mhm.
even me not even realizing this, because I grew up with it, so it just comes out of nowhere, and I don't fight it because I'm not that aware of it. It's automatic for me.
So, as a survivor of intimate partner violence, when you went through the first experience, what resources did you use, or what resources do you wish were available to you at the time?
That was very interesting, because at San Francisco General Hospital, um, there is an office for people with violent trauma experiences. And of course, I automatically was, they were written up, all of my, everything that ever happened in that office. So they were well aware of where I was in domestic violence at every time. But I never went there for therapy, and I never followed up on that office, which was probably a mishap for me, because I probably really needed uh, help with my experiences in my life, and I never followed up on that.
And for men who are survivors of intimate partner violence, what key message or messages would you share with them as they are dealing with this particular experience?
Wow, that's a big one, because we really don't talk about that stuff with partners. Um, of course, for me, the goal was shame, and I was covered with shame, and I had no idea where I was in that. I didn't have, um, uh, um, yeah, I basically was unable to talk about that. So it was very hush hush and very silent. And I wasn't sharing that. I didn't have a therapist, and I wasn't active. And every time something like that came along, I was surprised. And I had to take it one moment at a time, every single time. And, didn't, it wasn't, I wasn't that aware of domestic violence in my life with partners that were violent.
Mhm.
It just didn't um, feel the shame that comes up for me now when I have to share it.
And I want to say thank you for having the courage to tell your story, um, especially before people who you don't know. And I can only imagine how scary or difficult that may be. But I do want to thank you for sharing your story, because it helps to bring about the awareness of IPV
Mhm.
in general, and then IPV experienced by men. So thank
Mhm.
you for that, because it then allows us to be a little bit more, again, promoting the awareness, but being a little bit more comfortable having these difficult conversations. I do have one more question for you before we segue to Dr. Fawcett. But in your opinion, what are some key steps that we can take to promote a more inclusive and supportive environment for male survivors of intimate partner violence within the context of HIV?
Boy, that brings a bigger picture, because because HIV really isn't part of domestic violence, and it never has been. And I don't remember ever bringing HIV in the picture, because both partners that I had violent experiences with, neither one of them were positive, and neither one of them leaned on my positive.
Understood. So again, thank you for that. Before we segue over to Dr. Fawcett, I want to make 2 points. One, if you could please put in the chat your name, your pronouns, and where you're tuning in from or participating from. And also feel free to have some conversations and discussions in the chat. I am looking at them as we are interviewing our 2 panelists, and where we'll be bringing some of those questions up later in addition to any questions that you would like to have within the larger group. Okay, so with that said, Dr. Fawcett, can you explain the role of stigma and discrimination in the experiences of individuals living with HIV who may be dealing with intimate partner violence? So that's the first question.
It's a big one.
This is for Dr. Fawcett, sorry.
Stigma, I think, is the common thread that runs through. And although Steve had those really separate, I think, with HIV and IPV, in many cases they do overlap. And stigma really conceptually goes back, the guy that worked on this with in the 60s, but he talked about stigma as these conditions that people have or attributes that somehow lessen them or make them less valuable to society in a way. And unfortunately, with the clients that I have and in my own life, I've mentioned, there's a lot of addiction. I'm a gay man, I'm HIV. Sometimes there's mental illness. There's all these layers. Sometimes people are sex workers, layer and layer and layer of stuff that society judges. And so that's coming from the outside, right? And so that can be race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and so on. And that comes with labels. And these labels start to be imposed on people who are experiencing these conditions. So being passive, being weak, being responsible for their own behavior, being trapped. And these things really ignore any kind of structural inequities. They ignore the complexities of it. So many times for IPV, we hear, why don't people just leave? Well, it's a lot more complex than that, right? It's not so easy, but from the outside view, looking down on this situation, it's easy. But the real danger here is that people living those circumstances start to believe it themselves. I think everybody's heard the term internalized homophobia or internalized homonegativity, where if we're judged so much, after a while, we start to believe that stuff ourselves. The same is true for both HIV and IPV, and it's kind of a potent mix when they overlap. And so we internalize that stigma. We start to believe it ourselves and think that, yeah, this is all about me. And that has real world consequences. There's people that start to have poor adherence to their antiretroviral medications, for example. They delay getting health care. And so by the time they do have something, it's far more progressed. They're sicker, even getting tested, finding out you're HIV. Sometimes people who don't have the self-esteem, the self-worth, the freedom of choice, even delay those things. So it has real world implications. We see that in mental health, depression, anxiety, feeling hopeless, feeling isolated, feeling rejection, and partners of the partners of people who experience violence, the perpetrators, if you will, really can pick up on this in subtle ways. They might not be conscious of it, but I think like Steve said, these people kind of found him. I think that's very often the case, that people kind of read on that and pick up on that and take advantage of that, more to the point. And then the third part, which is really the most dangerous, is that people who internalize all this stuff start to project it outward. So, gee, if I tell somebody that I'm living with HIV, they're going to judge me or they're going to leave me. And some of this is fact. The Kaiser Family Foundation a couple of years ago many decades into the HIV epidemic, people still think I can get something like a quarter of people in the United States think you can get HIV from, sharing a water glass or living in household with somebody. This really bad information. But people coming from a place of fear start to project that and start to not seek out the help they need. And by the way, there's some differentials in here too. We know that women living with HIV actually have a harder time than men coming to terms with that. They're less likely to seek help. They're less likely to go out. But that we call it anticipated stigma. It's like, okay, what is the world going to think of me if they were to find all this stuff that I know? And Steve also mentioned that kind of idea of secrecy. And in many cases, and boy, to his credit, Steve is really out there talking about his story now, which is so healing, I think. But so many people feel trapped. Like if the outside world knew this was going on, they'd leave me, they'd judge me, or it would get worse. So that's the role stigma plays. Just really a kind of a bad cycle that people get trapped up and get caught up in.
So let me ask you a follow-up question, and then I have a couple. One, what are some of when you talk about, like Steve mentioned, the individuals just found him. Like, what are some of the signs that people need to be cognizant of that will say, hey, maybe this will lead to me being in an intimate partner violence type of situation? Like, what are some of those red flags or things that people need to take into consideration that something here is a little off? Maybe I need to be on the reside on the just be a little bit more cognizant of it.
Yeah, and I think the most obvious one that people report is kind of controlling personalities, if you will, that ultimately sort of lead to isolating the person, to cutting them off from their friends, their family, their support system, so that they are really kind of, maybe trapped is not the right word, but they're kind of caught up in this world that all their resources, their ability to have what we call agency, power to control their lives, all that control gets kind of taken away, and it's very subtle. It happens bit by bit, right? And you don't even know it's happening sometimes. And then and there's all kinds of ways of emotional manipulation and guilt tripping and that kind of stuff. But I think sometimes the controlling piece, I think, is the one that I would encourage people to just be on the lookout for, and then always kind of mixing from the potential person who might be caught up in an IPV situation to really make sure they have good sense of themselves, good self-esteem, they have resources, they have independence, and all those things that kind of keep them less likely to get caught up in that kind of over-controlled situation that can lead to violence and worse, right? It can lead to, there are a lot of people that get killed in the situation too. So it's a very dangerous situation.
And then we talked a little bit about stigma. So how can healthcare providers help reduce the impact of stigma in these situations?
Really such a great question, because healthcare providers, I think in general, are sometimes reluctant to go there. And especially these days, medical providers sometimes think this is my work, and the physical body, right? And they kind of ignore the other stuff around the edges, because those are hard conversations. And I know when I train other therapists, we really encourage them to ask. And that's the number one message I would say, is people need to ask. And it doesn't need to be confrontational or judgmental, because people who are, and Steve mentioned the word shame, which is so pervasive in these situations. People have a lot of shame, so they're reluctant. They're really on the lookout for any kind of judgment on the face of the provider, whether it's a therapist or a doctor or a nurse or a peer or whoever. They're so aware of the potential for being judged and shamed and further cut off that they often protect this stuff. It's a deeply held secret. So I really encourage providers to gently and openly create a safe space where we can have these conversations and not do the silly kind of assuming that people have a lot of ability in this case. Like, what would you do differently? Well, sometimes they wouldn't do anything differently. The people in the situation, they don't feel they have a choice, right? And so I kind of try to work my way in. I might say, well, do you and your partner have a lot of conflict, or how do you handle conflict in your situation? And that kind of leads to an identifying some of the behavior patterns there. But we know just statistically, if a provider asks, are you having issues? Is there control? Is there violence in your relationship? People want people experiencing this want the provider to ask that, and many of them will get help. There was a survey I just read preparing for this. 8 out of 10 people experiencing IPV want their provider to ask. Their penchants are because of shame and other issues and fear of judgment. They're not going to bring it up themselves. So providers really need to kind of lead the way in a non-judgmental, safe way and ask. And then it's not enough to ask. Then you have to be willing to provide resources. Okay, now what? How do you create a safety plan? How do you what are the resources for you? How do I then intervene and help this person make a difference in their lives to get out of this bad situation?
So let me ask you a follow-up question there, because you said a lot within that. What is it that someone should look for in a provider? Like, what are those things they should be checking off? Like, I need for my provider to be able to have these things or know this type. It's like you would like a medical doctor. Like, I want my doctor to be able to be comfortable asking me questions about reproductive health or sexual health, or whatever the case may be. But what are those things that someone should consider when looking for a provider, a mental health provider?
First and foremost, I would recommend that people really, in their gut, have a comfort level with this person, right? Not every therapist or provider or peer worker or anybody who's in that kind of position is right for everybody else. So I think it's a little bit of chemistry that goes on, but I think that they want to feel safe and they want to feel open. And there's so much shame, and this happens even with around medical issues with HIV. I have a lot of clients who go to an HIV doctor, go to a gay doctor, but they don't want to go if they are, fear they have an STI because they're embarrassed about it. So they go to an anonymous clinic for that. So I think the same thing, in partner violence has that same heaviness to it. And so I think that ability to be comfortable with somebody, and also just in terms of conversation, if you can get a sense of the provider's comfortable talking about this. As a therapist, I know other therapists just have their own stuff, right? They have their own blind spots. They have their own issues. And many of them don't want to talk about sex or violence or these kind of deep relationships. They think, well, that's none of my business. Well, it certainly is their business. And I think the person experiencing IPV, I think, really has to be tuned in to, am I able to have a comfortable conversation about uncomfortable things with this person? I think that's the bottom line here. And it may not be a fit, and I would encourage people that it's okay if you're seeing a therapist and it's not a good fit. Bye-bye, Charlie, and go to the next one, because you need somebody that you can talk to about this stuff. Really important.
And in addition to that, because you touched base on this one, how can mental health professionals like yourself effectively support individuals living with HIV who are experiencing or at risk of intimate partner violence, considering the potential impact on their mental well-being?
Right. And so the big thing I would say is just the ability to have that conversation, right? That to ask about it. And there's a lot of tools, even for physical health providers. The one that comes to mind right now is something called HITS. It's an acronym for: are you being hurt? Are you being insulted? Are you being threatened? Is there screaming in relation to that? These are quick checklists that say, okay, there's something else. Now I need to dig a little deeper on this. So I think having a really good knowledge of resources in your community where, okay, if somebody, and just statistically, if you're seeing people, a percentage of them are going to be experiencing IPV. And so it's really just good practice to have an awareness of, okay, what are the resources I have in the community? Where can I go? I work with the LGBTQ plus community. A lot of traditional shelters don't accommodate them, right? Where do we send a transgender person, a transgender woman who may not have transitioned yet or may have the surgery yet? Where does she go? Because the traditional things for women aren't going to accept her. So, and those kinds of issues that are really problematic. We can talk more on, we're going to talk, I think, about LGBTQ in a moment, but there's a lot of traditional things like that are there. The other thing I mentioned before, I think, is just therapists have these kind of standard phrases we use sometimes. It's like, what could you have done differently? Or what would you like to change? And that's okay in traditional therapy, but in this situation, that almost lays the blame again on the person experiencing IPV. Or what would you do differently? It's like they have a choice. And, it's not their fault. It's not their responsibility. It's the person perpetrating this on them. And so those kind of questions can actually, instead of being helpful, can kind of shove somebody deeper into a protected area where they're not going to talk about that. So those traditional questions, I think, are there. And then the other thing too, without getting too much in the weeds, with attachment styles, a lot of people experiencing interpersonal violence have what we call attachment insecurity. They're afraid people are going to leave them based on experience, right? This has happened in their lives. They're going to judge them. They're going to hit them. They're going to hurt them. They're going to somehow abandon them because they have HIV, because they do cancer work and so on. And so I think it's a really important for therapists to have an awareness just of the bigger issues here. This is not just about the individual who has total freedom of choice to do whatever they want to do. It's about all those other factors that have a role in this that maybe aren't as easy to see, but they're really important in determining the outcome.
I want to segue a little bit we talked about the providers, but just in your personal opinion, like what do you think keeps the general society and not wanting to become involved or wanting to learn more or even I don't want to say assisting because they don't need to assist in this particular situation, but being less disregarding?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I don't have an easy answer. I think so much. This is a painful thing that happens, IPV, and I think in many ways we don't want to see it. We don't want to admit it's happening in our community or with our neighbors or in our own home sometimes. So we have a lot of denial about it. And I think I would encourage people to be willing to kind of have those tough conversations and also to really look at their own blind spots. Because I think we have a great capacity as human beings for denying stuff that's going on and just not being willing to see it. And I think just to really humanize the situation. It's so easy to kind of create, this is happening to that other person, right? Not me, not people like me. And just we kind of stereotype and make them the other. And I think just to really understand this is happening to our parents, it's happening to our siblings, it's happening to our children. And so what can we do about these are people that are being affected by this. And I think it humanizes it in a way that especially with intimate partner violence, it's so easy to just kind of disconnect from it because it's so uncomfortable. And we can tell ourselves it's really none of my business. Well, yeah, it is. It is because it's probably happening in your own family or with your own friends. And so it very much is our business. It's all of our business. So just to be more open to the idea, we need to talk about this.
Absolutely, especially when you're hearing that the cases or types of IPV are happening at a younger and younger age. It's just not with adults, but you have youth who are exhibiting such behaviors or are experiencing intimate partner violence as well.
Yeah, for sure.
So I have another question for you before we turn it over to the audience for any questions. As a person living with HIV and a certified sex therapist, could you share your insights into how HIV status can intersect with issues related to intimate partner violence within the LGBTQ plus community?
For sure. I think, I mentioned when I was talking about stigma a few minutes ago that we have all these identities, right? And I think we can be a sexual minority, in that LGBTQ plus community, we can be living with HIV, we can be survivors of intimate partner violence. There's all kinds of labels that go on. And I think the same dynamics start to kind of blend together and tie together. And so I think they all kind of reinforce each other. And there's a lot of shame. Shame is one of the kind of the glue that holds a lot of that together, along with what a therapist would call unhealthy or negative core beliefs. I'm unworthy, I'm unlovable, nobody ever stays with me, everybody leaves me. And these kind of beliefs about ourselves that just create this fear that goes on. And I think in the LGBTQ plus community, that gets even more profoundly expressed. And by the way, that everybody, of course, that's not just a homogenous community, right? And there's even statistically with intimate partner violence and HIV, we know that bisexual and transgender, but especially transgender individuals, experience the greatest amount of stigma, violence, discrimination, and even murder. Frankly, it's shameful how much that occurs in our country. And so I think we need to look at how this gets expressed in that community, right? And it just takes on an extra layer of stuff. So you can blame the abuse on the partner's identity. You can deny that abuse is part of the LGBTQ plus community. I've had that experience in my own community. When I tried to raise awareness about this, people said, my God, we've talked about HIV, we've talked about addiction, let's not even go there. So there's this community denial about that, the fact that it exists. And some of that extends to like the law enforcement. Very often if a couple, a lesbian couple or a gay couple or anybody in the community has domestic violence, the police come, what do? They arrest both, right? Or they minimize this. This is just what gay people do. So there's a minimization of the impact of the thing. There's a problem I mentioned with shelters. Very often I've had cases where I got a client into a shelter and guess what? The perpetrator got himself into the same shelter because they're both men. And so these kind of issues just dramatize how that works. We see physical abuse, withholding hormones from a transgender individual, like not letting them have their hormones that they need to maintain their identity, targeting genitals or the chest for physical abuse. So there's different ways it kind of gets expressed in this community, out for threatening to out the person, either about their HIV status or about their gay status to their family, to their employer, to the church, to their friends. A lot of this may be deeply held secrets. And so that's a powerful thing that people can abuse and use, forcing sex in exchange for food and housing. And so the list goes on and on, saying that, well, this is just how gay relationships are, right? With this kind of power dynamic and abuse. And so it's a big problem that just deepens the existing problems of IPV and HIV in general. You add this other layer. I did want to say what I'd recommend for people to do. And first of all, and this is not for everybody, but I think community awareness. We've done some really good work. I live in a fairly gay, and by that I'm generalizing to mean LGBTQ plus community, but we've done some training with the police, to raise awareness so they understand better, like, what are we seeing? How are we dealing with it? To look at their own spots. They can, I'm sure there's a lot of jokes about gay people, behind the scenes there. So to just raise awareness and put a spotlight on them and make them accountable for more responsible behavior. Looking at shelters, I had a huge problem a couple of years ago getting a gay man suffering IPV into any kind of shelter. And we worked out a system with gay guest houses where they would provide a room. So using kind of creative solutions, right, in the community. But more, and this goes back to my original message, I think we have to just make it a safe place where people can talk about what's happening. Because if the big systems, whether it's law enforcement, the courts, therapists, doctors, if we're kind of denying it or not going there or not seeing it, it just really further disempowers the person experiencing it. And they really then can feel like they have nowhere to go. And so in many cases we are, and I'm speaking as the therapist, we're kind of the last resort sometimes of a connection. Steve and I were talking before we got on here about that powerful word connection, right? The two key words, resilience, which certainly Steve has a lot of, and connection. We need connection to family or friends or somebody, because one of the great things, as I mentioned, is people get isolated. The abusing partner is a control freak, and they eliminate these other outlets where somebody might find connection and hope. And so I think to really throw a lifeline, if you will, and be a safe place somebody can talk to about it is really key.
So yeah, I enjoyed hearing your points on that and gave a lot of food for thought, in that these conversations are very much needed for a myriad of reasons. One, if we don't have these conversations, like I wouldn't even know some of the stuff that you just mentioned, like the challenges that LGBTQ plus communities are experiencing, and even having to share a space, a living space with the perpetrator. So these conversations are very much needed, because if you're on any type of social media outlet, you have an internet connection, your phone or whatnot, there's a likelihood that you're going to come across some type of tickler or a headline that domestic violence, IPV, has happened. And the fear is that without these conversations, we may continue to be desensitized by it. So wanted to mention that point. We're now going to open the give participants an opportunity to ask members of the panel question. However, I do want to share this disclaimer. This webinar's primary goal is to provide information and stimulate discussion on HIV and intimate partner violence. Please be aware that the information shared during the Q&A is not intended to replace professional consultation or personalized advice. For personalized guidance or assistance related to these topics, we recommend reaching out to qualified professionals or appropriate organizations that you feel comfortable with. The opinions expressed by our panelists are their own and may not represent the official stance of Gilead Sciences, Inc. However, it is very important what they are sharing, both Dr. Fawcett and Steve as well, because they're sharing their personal experiences in addition to professional experiences. Use this information as a starting point for further exploration and consult medical providers, again, within your community when making decisions or seeking assistance. The information that we provide, of course, are resources, but it's at no intent of providing personal consultation to you if you have any questions pertaining to that. So just wanted to say that much. Okay, so if we have any questions, I'm going to ask that you come off the mics, unmute yourself, and we're going to take a few. We have a few minutes to do so. Any questions? Yeah, I see we have quite a bit of chat in here. Let's go through and see. Questions for our panelists? Anybody want to share a thought? You can come off the mic if you want to. I do want to acknowledge also that Linda Scruggs says she's in the webinar as well, and Linda is the co-executive director of Ribbon. So, hi, Linda. Okay, Miriam, see your hand is up. You can go ahead and speak.
I just want to say thank you for this platform, because they stuck breast cancer awareness in this month, and it kind of shaded over the domestic violence piece. And it just made me a little angry, because I'm a domestic violence advocate. And it's not that I think breast cancer is any less important. It's just that it seemed to just push the domestic violence piece to the side. And also to hear from different point of views and different perspectives, I thank you.
Okay. Thank you for sharing. Appreciate that thought. Okay, and we have Timothy. Timothy, we're asking you to unmute. You can share your thought or your question. Thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate Steve and Dr. Fawcett for this conversation, and it's really important. I'm originally right now from Portland, Oregon, and I work in only one organization who serve Slavic survivors from domestic violence. And occasionally I'm gay, and we right now start working with Slavic LGBT survivors from domestic violence. And I just wondering, do you have in San Francisco, in California, some cultural specific I know what you don't have cultural specific organization, but who, because I have some folks who live in San Francisco who Slavic, what's a better resource for referral to, because some of them, they experience domestic violence, what is a better resource for referral of them? And one part of the cultural specific way, English know so well, and yeah, what's a better resource? Thank you, and I really appreciate for this conversation.
Thank you for your thought. Thank you for sharing. I do have a question for both Steve and Dr. Fawcett, and we're going to look in the chat again, see if any hands are raised to ask any follow-up questions as well. But can you share examples of successful interventions or programs that in your community or that you're aware of that have effectively addressed the intersection of HIV and IPV?
Well, I'm in South Florida, Miami, Fort Lauderdale area, and I wish I could say there was a program that specifically has that intersection as its mission. There isn't one that I know of, at least. We do, however, have some really successful programs. And I think at this point, it's come down to the idea of individuals and their experience and what they're willing to focus on, what they're willing to talk about. And so I think maybe this is an issue of training, right? Because just to raise the awareness, we are so siloed in our training. Sometimes we get issues on where we have mental health or addiction or HIV or IPV, but nobody kind of connects all the dots. And I think that's what we need right now are these kind of interventions that where people have an understanding, where there's an easy kind of back and forth between understanding that these are stigmatized things out there in the world that impact the insides of the people experiencing it, and that they need somebody to talk to that can talk about all of it. And so I think where I think a program undercuts itself is by just taking a sliver of it and not looking at the whole bigger picture. And I think that's probably a matter of training, a community-wide training, just to really raise awareness of the intersectionality of all this, right? Because we get so caught up in our own little worlds that we don't see the bigger picture. So I think where I've seen successful programs, and there are now a couple that I can think of that are doing good work, for example, with the LGBTQ community, and they've long had an awareness of HIV that's almost standard in the community these days. But to talk about that IPV still is so stigmatized, and to really kind of in our community, and by that I mean the LGBTQ community, to really raise awareness of that and have providers put it in their universe of knowledge. They start to really think about it. Okay, maybe that's going on here. Because as I say, the clients in generally are not going to bring it up unless we ask. And so just to know how to ask correctly so that you're not further stigmatizing the person or pushing them away or burying them in further shame, but really to kind of, as I said, throwing a lifeline where they can grab onto it and start to talk and have a conversation, person to person. And my approach, whether it's in my own office or in these programs, I think is really, really person to person, right? It's not expert and client. That just never works for me. I think it has to be, I'm a social worker by training, and the original word the social workers used about this was a friendly listener. And I think that's what we need to be. We need to be people that are informed and can have these conversations. And that's what makes a good program in my mind.
Steve, did you have any thoughts about that as well? Any programs or suggestions for resources? Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. In San Francisco, I think we lack the combination of these two, of HIV and domestic violence, and I think it exists in nonprofit therapy, and you have to kind of dig because it's not out there and open. It's pretty much within nonprofits that you have to dig and you have to call and you have to ask around, because it's not, the combo has not been processed well, where it's not out there as the two issues being handled together and clearly public. That just doesn't exist, and it should, but it doesn't. So go to a nonprofit in San Francisco would probably be the way to go.
Any other questions? I'm
Yes.
going to also, yes.
Yes, I have a question. My name is James. What are some of the verbal signals that you can get if a person is violent? What are some of the verbal things that they would say to you if they're violent?
That's a good one.
Because it's a situation where sometimes they say things about I'm going to spank you or start to hit you as if they were playing, but it's some signs there. But what do you look for besides those signs I just mentioned?
I
Well,
look for anger. I look for anger, and I look for the response to anger on their part. But it's difficult because at that point you're not ready to go there. So you want to touch it very, very carefully to not start a big conversation or a big argument that affects both individuals, because you're trying to keep the love established, and you have to be really, really careful how you do that. So I really am a back office kind of guy. I'm not gonna jump in and assume anything. I'm gonna be really, really careful with that information. But yeah, I would ask the doctor.
yeah,
Thank you.
I like what Steve just said, and to that I would add, there's a lot of manipulation, right? And it's not always anger, it's not always even violence. And this happens too, where we say, well, this is what gay relationships are, right? They involve a lot of hitting and control. Well, not so much. But so there's a lot of control, manipulation, but I go the other side and go, oh, I'm so sorry. I feel so bad. I'm gonna kill myself. It's all manipulation all around the edges, and whatever flavor it looks like. And it doesn't always have to be anger, but it always involves some element of manipulation and control. And that can be by feeling, I feel so bad, honey. I'm so sorry. This will never happen again. Or it can be, just downright anger. But it's all those different forms. But to me, the common denominator is manipulation and control, and whatever that looks like, as opposed to specific words. I think those are the dynamics that I would look for.
I was just thinking.
Okay, and I see that Wanda has her hand up. She can come off the mic and ask your question or make a comment, please.
Um, First, hello, David. It's good to see you.
Hey,
Um, as a survivor of intimate partner violence, which happened long before I ever was diagnosed with HIV, but irregardless of when it happened, it's an intimate partner violence. To the person's question just a moment ago, oftentimes there aren't ways to tell ahead of time that this person is going to be an abuser. They often are very kind and loving and ooh baby, and all this stuff. But in the blink of an eye, that switch gets flipped, and the next thing you know, your face looks like hamburger meat. Okay. And there aren't real easy ways to tell what it is that's going to trigger that person. In my experience, and I've survived 3 of them. Okay. The other thing is, in my area, there are a significant lack of AIDS service organizations that could help persons that are living with HIV and being abused, or help people living with HIV, period. But there is a significant lack of that. And there is also problems with places for people to go, shelters. We have almost no shelters for men, whether they be, straight, gay, trans, or whatever. We have almost no shelters for men that are being abused. The ones for women often are very, very full. So it's a difficult situation. So one thing that I would say to you, if you have a friend that is being abused, don't ever ask them, why don't you just leave? Because until you walk in their shoes, they may not have the funds to do it. We living with HIV notoriously live in poverty. We can't just pick up and go. And if there are children in the picture, it's incredibly difficult. The other thing, all providers are supposed to ask if you feel safe where you are. Even just that simple statement, do you feel safe? That opens the window to perhaps another question. So just wanted to put my 2 cents in. Thank you.
Real quick, I see you, Steve. I just want to make a couple notices. Thanks everyone for sharing your thoughts. Again, it takes courage to share your personal experiences with IPV, especially in a group of people you don't know. So I want to say thank you. And also through the community lens of sharing how we can bring about even a greater awareness and promotion of IPV, and even getting this information out even further. I'm gonna put in a plug. So this webinar will live on our Community Voices page. I will share it in a separate newsletter for people to watch the replay. I also have in the chat a link to complete an evaluation on behalf of this webinar. I know people may not like to do so, but it really helps us out because it allows us to see what information and content that you want. We don't want to be in the business of providing webinars that you don't find useful. So if you could, it'll take you about 3 minutes to do so. So if you were to click on that link, it'll open up in a separate browser. And if you'll spend just a couple minutes of your time completing that completing that evaluation, we greatly appreciate it. Steve has a question, and then we'll be on the coming to the end of our webinar. And I do want to allow our co-executive director, Linda Scruggs, to have the floor if she has any final thoughts. Steve?
So I didn't mention, and I thought it was important, that my most previous partner was doing meth. And every time he did meth, he would come home and start screaming and yelling at me for hours. And I would take it and I would never do anything about it. I would just cover my face and try and get under the covers and try and avoid it as much as I can. That only made him more mad, and that even made him continue to yell a little louder and a little more violent. And I just took it. I didn't know when he finally did that to my roommate called the police, called for immediately to get a restraining order. And I kept on thinking, why didn't I get that restraining order like a year and a half ago? Darn it, why didn't I know how to do that? So that's an option that's available to everyone, and I didn't use it. Another thing is, I really wish I would have had therapy during this time, and I still haven't had any therapy, and I think I should still have that. So those 2 issues were missing, and I think they're valuable, and I think we need that.
Very great. And this is great. Thanks for sharing that as well. I want to give a special thanks to several groups within here. First to Steve and David, Dr. Fawcett, who are our wonderful panelists who provided some insightful information during today's webinar. I also want to say thanks to everyone in this room for participating. You know, there may have been other things that you could have been doing at this time, but you decided to share an hour with us. So thank you on behalf of Ribbon and Rock for Aging. I'm going to ask Linda, if she would like to come off the mic and share one final thought before we bid you all adieu.
I just want to tell everybody thank you for being with us today. It was fabulous. Our speakers and everyone who gave comments and questions. That's it. Thank you for hanging out with us. We'll see you next month. We have a great session planned for next month already. Please complete your evaluation. Thank you, Shauna, for great moderation as well. Let's give Shauna a hand as well. Thank you, Shauna.
Thanks, everyone. So I hope you continue, or I hope you are enjoying will enjoy the rest of your day. See you hopefully next time. Bye-bye.